Thank you. But yeah, so let's get started. In my head, and I think in a lot of other people's heads, when we think about the trajectory neural foundation models will take, it will follow the trajectory, hopefully, of internet AI. This roughly looks like we first built models that work really well in single tasks. We then discover, wow, it actually transfers to a lot of related settings and data sets. This is great, we've seen that so far. And then we conclude in the scaling strategy. We train on a lot of data, and then the model can be used everywhere. I would say that, like mentioned, we've seen at the workshop that transfer seems to work pretty well, sometimes in surprising ways. So we're somewhere in the middle, and now we need to take our next step to scale up. And it's a little bit stressful. It's a little bit anxious at this point. We're not exactly sure if we'll make mistakes when we're scaling up, and we want to know if we'll be able to pull this off. The steps we've taken so far have seemed relatively easy, and the narrative of internet AI says we just have to scale, but actually progress always involves a lot of mistakes and pain. And I think that especially for things like scaled up foundation models, this pain means that there's going to be potentially a big cost in money, GPU hours, grad student tears. So we want to avoid that if possible. And really, we think, how do we build confidence that when we scale, it's going to work? What exactly do we do? What I want to advocate is beyond sort of taking existing recipes that work, and even beyond existing ideas like scaling laws, I think there's a lot to learn from the culture of machine learning, which involves things like open data and open code that have been discussed. So I want to draw your focus to a third thing, evaluation. And this has been mentioned usually as an afterthought, but in machine learning, evaluations are sort of our metric for progress. And yesterday there was a comment by, or a question early on when will we know, when can we stop guessing and checking whether our models are working or not? And I argue that we will never stop guessing and checking. It's going to be with us forever. So we better make sure that the guessing and checking we do is somewhat efficient, so that we can sort of minimize the amount of times we have to do it. Which begs the question of how do we decide which evaluations to do? This is extra pertinent, I think, for neural foundation models, because in internet AI, it's somewhat intractable, and there's a lot of people working in the area, so we can kind of just evaluate everything. Even at this workshop, the different people building foundation models work in different areas and care about different applications. It's not so obvious that we can just brute force our evaluation strategy. So I think I wanted to think about what principles we can use to design our evaluations. So I'm going to frame our BCI model effort in terms of how we designed our evaluations. I'm going to talk about how we designed our evaluations to be relatively pragmatic, and how we designed them to test for generalization. And I think these are principles that can go beyond BCIs, hopefully so that we can convince both ourselves, each other, and the broader neuroscientific field that these foundation models do or do not have value. So when I mean pragmatics, I'm talking about the fact that we want to do evaluations in sort of predefined concrete use cases that apply to the real world. So in motor BCIs, we work with multi-channel spiking activity as our input, and we want to do behavior. We've seen this a lot so far. I think the only comment I want to make is in terms of pragmatics, what this means is we usually want to pre-train a model and say we want to reduce user burden. So we want to evaluate this so-called low data regime. I've done this myself in previous work. We say low data. Okay, so 100 seconds sounds like low data. We want to see if we start with just 100 seconds of data, we achieve some low performance. We do some pre-training on the x-axis with variable types of data, and maybe we can improve performance. So we did measure pre-training benefits, and it was going up as we included more pre-training data. This seemed like a good sign for profit. So this was great. And I was motivated to start this next project to scale this out even farther. At the time, I also measured multi-session scaling curves, and it was better, presumably because the data is much more similar. But I kind of dismissed it because I was like, okay, the green line is also going up. So maybe we can even sort of just obviate the need for multi-session data once we have sufficient multitask data. But this is not correct, right? In a pragmatic sense. So I think in a lot of foundation model evaluations, we will often pick some low data regime in the context of like a single session evaluation, but BCI users are implanted with these devices for a long time. And even monkeys that use these devices are implanted with devices for a long time. So we have plenty of multi-session data. And this is so much the case that like BCI practitioners or like papers are essentially nowadays written moving towards the multi-session modeling like default. So actually the pragmatic framing of evaluation for such BCI foundation model should be done by evaluating the marginal benefit of cross-subject transfer onto large multi-session data sets. And this should paint a much probably more marginal picture of benefits, which need to be weighed sort of in tension with the cost of using bulkier foundation models. So before I talk about this evaluation, I have just like 2 notes about methods. First is we are now going to try to decode all kinds of BCI, motor BCI related covariates from our multi-channel spiking activity. This includes kinematics or EMG or what have you. The salient point is that the behavior can have varied dimensionality as well as the neural data. Everyone basically talked about this. For our neural activity, this model will use a strategy to tokenize various spiking activity dimensionalities by cutting up sort of the channels into different patches. This was shown to scale in my previous work. There are different ways of doing it, so it's not really the point here. But yeah, so for example, if we have 96 channel spiking activity, what we're going to do is cut it into 3 tokens of 32 channels, and our neural activity is taken care of. For behavior, since we start with low dimensions, we're going to just use 1 token per behavior dimension and call that a day. So per time step, we have 3 neural tokens, 2 behavior tokens, and we'll just do next step prediction in order to train over widely heterogeneous data. Now we can actually evaluate in this sort of multi-session test set regime. So previously the baseline was 100 seconds. Now we're going to do 1.5 hours of multi-session data of a monkey doing center out. We're going to achieve 0.7 R squared here. And now I'm going to sort of pre-train larger and larger models that all include this data in the mix. But what we immediately saw was that actually including 200 hours of data from other monkeys doing related reaching tasks did not improve the performance at all. And so this was concerning. We thought maybe it was a signal issue, but including 200 more hours of data from the test monkey doing like other reaching tasks in another block of experiments did improve data. So our interpretation of this was that maybe cross-subject transfer is kind of bad once you have sufficient sort of like in-subject modeling data. So this is like a long tail measurement that is not really addressed, I think, in a lot of other papers and my own paper. And maybe this was just a matter of scale. So we increased our data to 2000 hours. And actually this yielded a new failure mode, which was interference, where the performance actually went down as we included more data, perhaps because the data is so diverse. And this is something that occurs in like multilingual language models sometimes. And the resolution is to increase model capacity. But all the increasing capacity did was just restore our previous like 0.72 performance. So now we have a sort of lesson here just from pre-training where we don't achieve gain from all this cross-subject work, and actually there is a cost, a computational cost to our ambition. And this is just one evaluation, so we now need to move downstream to consider the potential benefits across a much wider variety of tasks. I'll consider the schematic where to calibrate our expectation for pre-training, each of these lines are different models tuned on increasing amounts of downstream data. This red dot has a lot of pre-training data. This dashed line has not much pre-training data. We expect pre-training to mainly help in this low data regime. But using the schematic, we can ask concrete questions like, for example, how much does pre-training act as like an effective multiplier for downstream data? And at what point will the benefits from pre-training vanish because everything is performing the same with sufficient downstream data? We'd like this to be a lot because we want pre-training to be worth it, but we have already seen signs that maybe the convergence will happen by 1.5 hours. So first, we look at this bimanual cursor task, which is a human BCI task. We're going to compare 1 from scratch NDT model and 3 pre-trained models of increasing volume. As in the schematic, if we increase the amount of downstream data, we're going to see increasing performance. Wonderful. And as we increase pre-training, all the lines go up, wonderful. So everything was looking great. If we want to quantify it in the ways I just said, we don't see convergence by the high point of our evaluation data set of 40 minutes. And there's maybe like a doubling of effective downstream data we get from pre-training. Great. But as we looked at this across tasks, the results were much more mixed. So this line is not looking so good. And if we try to quantify the benefits, we see that there seems to be convergence by that point, which corresponds to about 3 hours of data. And also, even before that convergence point, there's less than an effective doubling of downstream data that we get from pre-training. So there's a lot of things that could be causing this. It could be task identity, it could be subject identity, like the type of behavior, the recording. But if you believe the narrative that we set out, we think that it's actually downstream data volume that might account for a lot of these effects to a first order. So we evaluated on a lot more different tasks, 8 different data sets of widely varied behavior. We compare our largest pre-trained model against a from-scratch model in a linear baseline. And our sort of conclusion from these trend lines was that pre-training is basically useful, like sort of our upstream results, up to 90 minutes of downstream data. The orange line is above the blue line, and they're basically the same by the end of the plot. And the important thing is that this reality is consistent with scaling, the standard scaling narrative, where if we flatten all of these evaluations and we train with bigger data and bigger models, the performance keeps going up by like 0.02 R squared. And so this is a cause for pause here, where we see a reality where NDT has like modest benefit for BCIs, which have a lot of downstream data, and scaling will occur, but it won't like really change the reality here. And so there's a lot of caveats naturally, because again, everyone has different methods, and maybe it's the data sets I used. So I don't really want to like overemphasize that particular conclusion, but I want to make a point like this evaluation is necessary to really make a convincing argument about foundation model capability to its potential users. And it's hard because it requires context on what matters to downstream users, but we need to do it, right? Or else we're just sort of talking to ourselves. And so the second principle I want to emphasize is generalization. One of the difficult things about this whole pragmatics analysis is that it's very expensive. Ideally, we would like some more insightful probes into model capability that don't require evaluating everywhere. And the kind of format I'll use to study this is there are often times where we will have our pre-training and a tuning data set, but what we actually care about is whether the model captures some broader concept related to our tuning set, but like not quite exactly just the tuning data. So I'll give a few examples here. So the first example is covariate shifts, where some like unmodeled aspect of our data has changed over time, for example, is in the setting. And we want to see if basically tuning at some point in time will sort of perform well, both 1 minute after sort of our tuning data set, but also much later where the neural statistics have begun to shift. Or for example, you could imagine the shift could also occur because the person is excited or sad and things are showing up in our neural data. In this setting, we can see that an hour past our sort of tuning block, there starts to become a lot of channels that have like reduced firing rates or higher firing rates than our baseline, where it's like mostly consistent. And we're going to tune our model on the in distribution 1 minute setting and compare performance in ID and OOD settings. And here, this is a relatively light distribution shift, so the performance isn't decayed that much, but this doesn't make a statement on what will happen when we pre-train, whether the benefits that are accrued to pre-training, which like increased ID performance, will sort of persist out of distribution, or whether it will sort of just be fragile and be really specific to the tuning distribution. And we'd really like to see it's the second case. In this case, it is the second case, which is great. And the optimistic interpretation of this type of result is that all those analyses that show that the neural code is well organized or like has some subspace that like abstracts out the context and benefits linear decoders might also benefit foundation models, but essentially like more effort would be needed to really make that kind of conclusion. But it would be really helpful because we don't want to evaluate our foundation models in the kind of like exponential context that could occur for neural data. The second point I'll make is about probing for the sort of learned knowledge that neural models might gain or foundation models might gain once we train on a lot of data. It's been tossed around as an idea. So I wanted to test whether we could like extract a prior from our model that reflects what we understand about center outreaching, which hopefully we can recover. And the specific prior I want to test here is whether or not we can get the sense that center out data is usually constrained to a kind of like low dimensional plane, for example. We can visualize this monkey's isometric center out task. These are messy trajectories, but they're trajectories nonetheless, and they're organized radially. And so using this visualization, this kind of prior understanding we have of this type of data, we developed this probe where we will train our model on 3 held-in angles, or tune our model on 3 held-in angles and evaluate it on all angles. And we're specifically interested in whether there's generalization to sort of this held-out direction. And we know that this type of generalization is possible because of the state visualization. We can also construct a linear decoder that generalizes, even if decoding is kind of crappy. But NDT model, when trained from scratch, for example, does not generalize. Actually, it snaps the sort of held out directions to held in categories, and by developing like a kind of attractor. But the crux, actually, the disappointing crux, is that the pre-trained model also basically copies the same strategy. It does not generalize. So the 2 interpretations of this type of result is that either the model has failed to learn this relatively simple prior about neural data that's like low dimensional, or maybe fine-tuning is not sufficient to surface that like knowledge about the data or to get it to act according to that neural prior. It's not exactly clear, but my point is that if we want to evaluate a model's understanding of like neural like mother manifolds, it's not obvious that it's that easy to even tell. Okay, so finally for BCI, the most important distribution shift is going to be the shift from offline decoding to online control. On the right here, I have trajectories from one of our human participants doing BCI control with NDT. This shift is so big that motor BCI labs don't always even use they often don't use deep networks. My own lab doesn't use deep networks for motor control because there's lots of problems that come up during motor control of deep networks. And I'm just going to show a few results here that like not in too much depth. We're going to get our linear baselines for 3 different participants on how well they can control a cursor. And the variability in these metrics is because these people have been implanted with devices for varying amounts of time, so the signal quality is different. And then we're going to plot our base and big NDT models. It's basically different scales. And the main point I want to make is that the overall metrics achieved by all of this pre-training is essentially the same. It is like a little bit better or a little bit worse than a linear model. And so the evaluation point is that sort of the conclusions we draw in offline decoding are not easily extrapolated to online control. And that has been well known to BCI practitioners, but I think maybe a little looked over in the foundation model narrative, especially if we're iterating on these offline metrics. So I think I took you through the sort of evaluation-centric narrative of this big pre-training project. I wanted to emphasize the idea that we should focus on pragmatics and generalization. The pragmatics principle is the fact that we should sort of evaluate the benefits of pre-training with respect to realistic downstream ranges that depend on the application. So for example, BCI has a very different downstream use case than consumer EMG, as we will shortly see. And generalization is the principle that oftentimes we are interested in evaluating like model capacity or capability that is like not fully represented in our tuning data set. And generalization can help us evaluate whether or not like these models have that capability. Yeah, okay. So just one final note, why now? I think earlier on, it was a little bit difficult maybe to say to reviewers that our models might not work in the real world, like early on. Our field has a little bit of momentum now, and the stakes are getting higher as we try to scale. And I guess overall, like neural foundation models it's an interdisciplinary field. We're half neuroscience, half machine learning. It's great to explore all these applications for neural data analysis. It's really exciting. I commend it. But I think it's also worthy to pay attention to the machine learning half of our culture, the side of the culture that focuses on really thoughtful evaluations, or at least a lot of evaluations to drive progress. Okay, thank you.